Americans for Fair Taxation presents the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, president of Americans for Fair Taxation, and recorded by Bob Paxton, a volunteer with the Florida FAIRtax Educational Association. And now, this week's Chairman's Report.
Hello, I'm Bob Paxton with the AFFT Chairman's Report for Friday, June 5th, 2020. Religion, Churches, and the Fair Tax. During the time of the American Revolution and the adoption of the Constitution in 1788, religion was such an important element in American life that few even considered that it was a right that needed to be protected. Now, although not part of the original Constitution, the first 10 amendments were submitted to the states on September 25, 1789, and adopted on December 15, 1791. The one that directly applies to religion is the First Amendment, which states, quoting now, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances." End of quote. Now, prior to the introduction of the federal income tax in 1913, there was no reason for the federal government to regulate the activities of churches or other charitable organizations. No income was taxed, and there were no deductions for the organization or its donors. After 1913, this started to change. Like most things associated with the income payroll tax system, a church or other charitable organization no longer escaped the attention of the federal government and its army of bureaucrats within the IRS. So, how does the IRS define a church? Well, the short answer is that it doesn't. A church is just one of a number of entities for which there is no specific definition in the Internal Revenue Code. The IRS simply says that a church must be a corporation. That's it. Now, as the bureaucrats like to do, they have developed some very general points that they believe a church must have in order to be tax exempt. IRS Publication 1828, Tax Guide for Churches and Religious Organizations, lists 14 criteria. They are a distinct legal existence, a recognized creed and form of worship, a definite and distinct ecclesiastical government, a formal code of doctrine and discipline, a distinct religious history, a membership not associated with any other church or denomination, an organization of ordained ministers selected after completing prescribed studies, a literature of its own, established places of worship, regular congregations, regular worship services, schools for the religious instruction of the young, and schools for the preparation of ministers. Now, the above points are not specific, but can be interpreted differently by different reasonable people. Therefore, IRS bureaucrats can decide that a specific church is not really a church, and in that case, they can decree that donations to that church are not tax deductible, and that those donations are actually income to the organization on which taxes must be paid. Now, often, challenging that decree entails a long and costly legal battle, something that most churches just can't afford to pursue. In addition, there are special rules for clergy and for income earned by churches from various other activities. Like most aspects of the Internal Revenue Code, these provisions are very complicated, and many are general and subject to different interpretations by different IRS agents. Now let's look at the Johnson Amendment. In order to help stop attacks against his political campaign from religious groups, then Senator Lyndon Johnson pushed through the following 1954 amendment to IRS Code 501c3, quoting again, "and which does not participate in or intervene in, including the publishing or distributing of statements, any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office," end of quote. Now, while the IRS has actually revoked the tax-exempt status of only a very few religious groups, the threat is always there. Many leaders of religious groups and other tax-exempt groups have been reluctant to become involved in political campaigns that may directly affect their charitable purpose. They were afraid to openly support candidates who favor the positions advocated by the exempt organization because they fear that doing so could cost them their tax-exempt status. As is the case in so many areas, the problem is not that the Johnson Amendment has actually been used to stifle the free speech rights of nonprofit groups, particularly churches and religious groups. The problem is that politicians and bureaucrats who disagree with an organization's message can use the threat of action against them to intimidate these groups into silence. As countless nonprofits found out in the Lois Lerner Tea Party scandal, IRS bureaucrats often let their own personal biases or the biases of their superiors affect their official actions, and unfortunately, they often get away with it. Take the example of a small church. Prior to the Johnson Amendment, if one candidate shared the church's belief on an important issue and the opposing candidate held the opposing view, the minister was free to speak out and urge his congregation to support the candidate who agreed with the church's position. Well, now it's different. The minister saw how Pastor Wright got away with endorsing Barack Obama from the pulpit in sermons that were widely broadcast, and no one tried to revoke that church's tax exemption. But he also saw how Lois Lerner made life difficult for organizations that she didn't like. Knowing that his is a small church that doesn't have the resources to fight the IRS, the pastor decides against saying anything in support of the candidate who shares the church's beliefs. The Johnson Amendment has intimidated him into silence. In truth, the Johnson Amendment is just another example of the ruling class and their minions exerting control over the rest of us for their own benefit. So, how will the FAIRtax treat churches? With the FAIRtax, most of the complications dealing with churches and other tax-exempt organizations will be eliminated. Donations made to legitimate charitable organizations and churches will not be subject to the FAIRtax. And since the income tax is gone, there will be no reason to be tax exempt other than the ability to receive donations without requiring the FAIRtax to be collected on them. Yes, there will still be requirements to qualify as a charity or a church, but it will be much, much simpler. In fact, most of the requirements will be to ensure that churches and other charitable organizations are not improperly competing with regular businesses. For example, it would be unfair if a church or other charitable group decided to start a grocery store to compete with the other grocery stores. But they had the advantage of not having to charge the FAIRtax on their sales, and a regular grocery store would have to charge it on theirs. In conclusion, as Thomas Paine said, spiritual freedom is the root of political liberty. As the union between spiritual freedom and political liberty seems to be nearly inseparable, it is our duty to defend both. George Washington said, "Religion and morality are the essential pillars of civil society." Now, does this mean that if you favor religious freedom, you should support the FAIRtax? Well, no, but you should support the FAIRtax because it not only helps protect your religious freedom, it also is good for the economy, and that's good for all of us. The other reasons to support the FAIRtax is that it will force the ruling class and their army of bureaucrats to do things in the open for everyone to see. Today, no one really sees how they use the tax code to reward their friends, punish their enemies, and control us all. They hide their actions in the largely incomprehensible forest of IRS rules and regulations that few even know exist. Now, we all know that cockroaches scatter when the lights come on. Replacing the federal income tax code with the FAIRtax would be like turning on a huge searchlight. The people trying to control us could no longer do it under the cover of darkness provided by the income payroll tax system. So, if you're ready to take a very significant step towards wresting control of your government back from a small group of corrupt people and making it possible for all to prosper, go to FAIRtax.org and join us. Then, contact your members of Congress and the President and demand that Congress pass the FAIRtax, the only truly fair tax.
This has been the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, President of Americans for Fair Taxation. Check back every week for news and information about the fair tax, and learn why the fair tax should replace our antiquated federal income tax system. If you'd like to receive a copy of the Chairman's Report in your inbox every week, sign up at FAIRtax.org.